Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday. Welcome to the BidVantage webinar for this month, which is Your Bid Fabulous? I've got Rob and Chris with me here today. There's a little bit of information about us. I've been around for a while, as most of you will know that join us on a regular basis. Started out in the NHS, moved into private healthcare and then consulting in various guises, and now ably supported by and working with Chris and Rob. Unfortunately, Katrina can't join us today. She's got something she needs to take care of. But I'll let Chris and Rob introduce themselves, and they can just tell you a little bit about their background. So, Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, we've all been working together for 5 years now. Seems like a very long time. But yeah, similar background to Matt, just 10 years less. I end up doing the bid writing though, and it's at least 150 bids. I reckon it's about 200 now across the last 15 years. And I've got a little bit of social value expertise, which we might drop in today if we've got time at the end.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. And Chris?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My background is the other side of bidding, actually being that buyer writing those tenders or frameworks. I've been doing that for over 15 years, worked for organisations like Crown Commercial Service, NHS Supply Chain, so responsible for understanding the market or the category area, writing the tender documents, doing the evaluation, doing the awards, and then managing that framework and trying to drive value, savings, and efficiencies through them. Kind of joined the other side of the coin kind of 2-3 years ago, trying to kind of add value to try and kind of share my knowledge about what's in the mind of the bidders, what's in the mind of the buyers, and share that. And then in the last kind of 2 years, I set up another company offering kind of net zero advice, so around carbon accountancy, and that's kind of quite important at the moment with kind of carbon reduction plans for any tenders over 5 million.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of our webinars are branded Best of Both, because what we realised, I would say maybe a year ago, was the value that having both sides of the table brings to bidding. And as Chris said, he works predominantly with bidders now. But it's always useful to get a procurement perspective on thinking, whether that's around development of service models, product lists, but also in review. And we might touch on that later on in today's webinar. But I think having Chris on board has really helped to shape our thinking, develop the way we do things, and challenge what we've done previously. So with that in mind, we should be looking forward to a really challenging session today, shouldn't we, Chris?
Well, I think it's just nice to have an opposing view or just some additional insight to build in to make sure that we're putting our best bid forward and we've got all that knowledge and expertise.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the things that really aids learning. And so for the people that have joined us today, please feel free to ask questions. If you don't agree with something we've said, please comment. We're more than happy to read those comments out and give a view back and have a discussion around that, because that's how we think the best learning happens. So if you want to ask something, drop it in the comments and we'll pick those up as we go through. As always, Rob mentioned his social value expertise, and we as a company always like to do something. So part of the webinars every month, we always offer at least 1 hour of different training. This, because it's about bid writing, will specifically be on bid writing. So at the end of the webinar, we'll pick somebody out of the hat when, well, we won't do it at the end, we will do it after the webinar, and we will get in touch and let you know who's won that. So today we're going to run through a quick agenda. We've got our observations, which have driven a lot of our thinking. Then we're going to move on to features, advantages and benefits, which is the core of today's webinar. And then we'll go into the WHWW, which needs a sort of better name because it's just a sound otherwise, that is Rob's development and probably best bit of design work, I think, over the last few years. So we'll come on to that and explain how all of that fits together. So in terms of our observations, we've split this into 2 parts. One is when we're producing bid strategies and running kickoff meetings. So bid's been released, start of the process. We will then go on to observations from bid reviews, which is either halfway through, at the end, or post submission. And Chris and Rob are going to go through those. I'll just quickly talk through bid strategy because that's predominantly part of my job. But the question that we always like to ask at any kickoff or pre-bid work is, why should the customer award you the contract? And quite often that's met with blank faces because people don't know. And that's not unusual. So if you think about your last bid or a bid you're working on now, if you sat your bid team down, or if you're just working on your own, if you had to answer that question, could you do it in a couple of sentences? Normally what we find is, if we don't get blank faces, we tend to get a list of what we would call features, and we will explain that as we get onto the features part of this. So, for example, we are the best, or we are the quickest, cheapest, safest. Well, that's great, but that thinking needs to be developed a bit further. So the question that generally tends to follow, why would we award you the contract, is so what? And that is in terms of, what does that actually mean? What information is it that you're trying to get across to the customer by saying we are the quickest? And that takes quite a bit of thought. And it also takes quite a bit of discipline, because it can get quite annoying, as I'm sure we've all seen in kickoff meetings, where we keep asking, so what, so what, so what, and someone will give an answer and we'll ask, so what again. And sometimes that can go through 1 or 2 questions, or it can go through 10 or 12. Eventually, hopefully, you will get to a point where somebody comes out with something that really means something and is linked back to what the customer wants and the specification. Generally, where we end up with are, we get to an advantage and a benefit, but often that's then incorporated into 1 or 2 sentences, which is often a value proposition. Now, that would be the thing that I would always be looking for in answer to, why should we award you the contract? And if somebody comes back with a very tight value proposition, they've probably done a lot of the thinking, they understand how they're going to deliver the product or service, and they're very confident in their offer. And the other part of this is why you are better than the competition. And part of that will come out as we go through features, advantages, and benefits in the main part of today. So that's from my perspective on this. Rob and Chris, is there anything that you want to throw in there before we get on to reviews?
I think it's. I think there's probably a big question in there, is if you can't articulate why you are best for the contract at the bid strategy kickoff session, there's probably a further element of qualification you need to do about the opportunity as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, a lot of times people are reactive bidders. They see an email land in their inbox and think, oh, that's what we do. We should have a bid at this, without having done any pre-bid work, without really knowing the customer. The first time they really kind of get into the bid is when they read the bid pack, and then they've got to try and piece everything together from that. And you're right, Rob, if they can't articulate it, probably should have been some pre-bid work going on.
Just a little bit. I think there might be an element to that, is think about what your core services are and do the exercise independently of a bid as well. We are the best because, so what, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, was there any observation from you on that one, or should we move on to bid review?
An observation about an observation.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would just think about the potential features that you're thinking about against the specification. Specification is obviously the key document coming from the contracting authority, which summarizes what they need and any pain points. And if you're not solving that's a good kind of qualification question before kind of going ahead and investing a lot of time in it.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Let's move on to the next one. And you guys are going to talk through this one.
Yes, bid review observation. So I end up reviewing a lot of bids from a content point of view, and I'll bring Chris in a minute as well, who often reviews bids with his procurement hat on, looking at the evaluation scheme. Does it meet the specification, etc. But from my point of view, so many times we see that features are included, but there's no development of advantages and benefits. There's no clear reason why those features are in there. There's often an assumption that the evaluator knows what the feature is, and we often see that with incumbents as well, who think, oh, well, the commissioner, council, whatever it is, well, they already know what we are and what we do. We don't need to elaborate on what that feature is. Well, as Chris would tell me, every bid is scored independently and looked at without any prior knowledge. So you have to keep stating the obvious. Doesn't matter if the advantage and benefit is really, really obvious for even the smallest thing, you still have to spell it out. Often, well, about 50-50, sometimes I see features and ideas in bids that don't bear any resemblance to the specification, or more likely they don't bear any resemblance to the question. Sometimes clients are looking to say what they want to say rather than actually looking at the specification and going with what the customer wants. That's not going to get you anywhere. The only chance we're getting marks for that is if they're looking for added value or a variant bid. As I said, if it's not on the page, it can't be scored. Always look at the evaluation criteria as well. Often to score maximum marks, they're looking for clear and obvious benefit.
Okay.
If the bid doesn't have features and advantages and benefits, it often feels very, very generic, as if you could have written that for anyone, any client, any service. Chris will go into how that feels for an evaluator, I'm sure, but just from a perception point of view, it never looks good, and you always want to put your best foot forward, even if you don't win the bid. And a key point I won't go into in too much detail today is marketing content is not bid content. Marketing content is usually lots of wowing people with all your features, but without actually elaborating on what that means. Bid content is feature, advantage, benefit. And I'll pass over to Chris for the procurement take on this.
Yeah, so from a procurement perspective, when I've evaluated myself or I've moderated evaluators, it's just going back to the scoring criteria that Rob's mentioned and asking for evidence in that response where the evaluators have seen that they should deserve, you know, an 8, a 9, a 10, or a 75 or 100, and asking them to clearly like highlight that, and then that kind of then forms the evaluation process and that the feedback that you may get as part of your kind of the feedback perspective. So I think making it easy, it's like a story, and it doesn't, and I know we've talked previously as well around character count, formatting, presenting and stuff like that. You don't get points for that. You get points for the detail on what's included. So, you know, we'll talk more about what's a feature and the rest of it, but suffice to say from a bid review process, what I find probably 9.5 times out of 10, there's just features. There's no so what. There's no where's the value, you know, the value that you're going to give me as part of that response. There's no so what. There's just this is what we're going to do. There's no why. Where's the benefit to me? Where's the benefit maybe to the end user if it's a product? Yeah, that's what we'll come up against a lot of the time. Okay.
Anything else, Rob? Were you about to jump in there?
No, I was just nodding my head and agreeing with Chris.
Excellent. The one thing that just sort of jogged a memory for me on this, where we were talking about marketing content not being bid content, was a couple of years ago, I did a lot of work with a marketing agency, and being used to bidding, it was quite frustrating in terms of how they wanted that information presented. It was completely different to how my brain would work. And one of the kind of big takeaways for me was that they were trying to draw an emotional, play on an emotional response to content to get engagement. Whereas bidding for me is more factual and mechanical. And that's not to say text can't be good to read, but actually there's far more of a process-driven element to it than trying to emotively engage with somebody. I think that kind of links back to what you were saying, Chris, around the scoring against the specification, the criteria. But what's really interesting, and I think this is probably where we're going to get to, is how you turn what essentially is a point scoring exercise into compelling text that's good to read. Right, shall we move on to features?
Yes, let's go.
Well, first of all, we might just want to have a quick think about this before we actually get into what a feature is. And we'll deal with with all three of them while we're here. So this took a whole load of arguing at our end to distinguish between what's a feature, what's an advantage, and what's a benefit in terms of bidding. So where we settled on, and feel free to put stuff in the comments and share your views with us, but we settled on a feature being something your service or product does or is. And that's obviously quite factual. So whatever you're saying should be fact there. Move that on to the advantage. The simplest thing that we could boil this down to was what problem it solves. And then in terms of the benefit, how your life or experience is improved by using that product or service. Now, there is quite a lot of overlap in all of these things, and it's very, very difficult sometimes to separate out. I think the features are fairly straightforward. The advantage and benefit is where this needs to be practiced and practiced. So you can say, this is the problem, this is the headache we're taking away from you, and this is what you get out the end of it. So we'll try and explain this as we go through, and then how that links into the WHWW. And I don't want to
the Oxford Dictionary definitions were no help at all with this, were they?
No, which is where we started and decided that that wasn't helpful at all. So as I said, feel free to share your comments with us on that, but that was the simplest form that we could break it down into, so it's easy for people to understand. Okay, so in terms of features, shall we have a look at these?
Shall we? Shall I start and then you guys kind of jump in? I think as we've said previously, features kind of just describe what the product or service is or does. It's the easiest one out of them, and it's the one that's probably the easiest, and we see the most of in bid responses. So some examples there we've talked about, our system is ISO 27001 compliant. Our staff complete 100% of mandatory training. Our phone has the best camera. Our customer contact center is accessible 24 hours a day. Stuff like that. It's just what the service does. So some of the things.
What there, Chris? So we'll get to that later.
Thanks, Rob. All those conversations are obviously starting to kind of, you're turning me from, a procurement professional into a bid professional slowly but surely. So some of the things to kind of consider when you think about the features as well. Does your product or service have something that's unique to you? Something that is recognized maybe by your customers or feedback that you get? I've talked about this before. How do those features align to the client specification? Remember, the client specification is their pain points or what they want to see in your response. So that's usually a good guide to use. And also, out of those features that you've identified in this first part, which ones add the most value, and what is that value? Is that pound saving? Is that time saving? And also, maybe, how does that kind of added value link back to any win themes that you've got? Or is that a win theme in itself? And can that be and which of the questions, of the quality questions, can you weave this into? Any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I just, with features, often I think people think they do need to be really snazzy and innovative and super interesting. Well, not really, actually. If it's a public sector bid, the council, NHS body, whatever it is, just wants assurance that you can do what they want. So your feature could be that you've got a HR system that timetables everyone really simply. Doesn't sound particularly interesting. You still need to say it because that's potentially solving a problem or meeting the specification. It doesn't have to be our system is the best thing in the world. It just has to do what what the council commissioner requires to happen. That's often a point I make to clients where they can't think of interesting things to tell us. Like, well, actually, sometimes you need to tell us the relatively boring things that just tick the boxes.
And that's just reminded me of a bid that we've just worked on, Rob, where in one of the drafts, some of the kind of core things had been taken out, trying to score the higher marks, because it was, let's show how extra we go beyond the specification. Let's talk about all the great added value stuff. But then the question didn't have the basics in, like it does A, B, and C in the spec. And I think that would be the key message, is don't forget the obvious features that the spec requires before you get into it does all the extra great things. And from a sort of added value or added extra point of view, there's a couple of bids that I've just noted down here. One where there was a piece of equipment that was being procured. There was a whole load of extra stuff that was built into this kit, but it wasn't in the specification, and it wasn't necessarily useful to the customer. I know you know who we're talking about, Rob, by that smile on your face. But that was into the bid, saying, listen, look at all this great extra value we're providing, look at all these extra features. The customer just didn't want them.
Well, because they couldn't meet the core features, could they, as well? That was another point. It was a case of trying to mask the fact that you couldn't meet the specification with lots of added value.
Yeah. And so when you do have extra things, the question you need to ask yourselves are they valued features by the customer? Because otherwise you're just wasting words that you could use elsewhere. And the other was a medical device, which was very, very different to the standard device that was on the market. And this had all sorts of features that weren't necessarily aligned to the specification. They were very close, but not quite. But the benefit was largely to the end user of the product. And this was a life-saving device. What it didn't do was benefit the person buying it. And that was a really interesting bid to work on, because you could see if you step back and looked at a bigger picture, people were going to have their life saved by this piece of kit, but that wasn't aligned to what the buyer was looking at or had been instructed to look at. And that again comes back to the kind of pre-bid engagement of how do buyers know that these features exist, and that's a really interesting webinar that we've done content on before around pre-bid engagement, what you use it for. And the term that we keep coming back to is educating the market. So if you have a new feature in an existing product, or you've got a new innovative product, how do people know they want it unless you go and speak to them? And so that for me isn't influencing specifications or procurement processes or anything like that. That is simply market education, because the benefit to that is the public sector are trying to spend tax money well and efficiently. And if they don't know there's a piece of technology there that exists, they can't buy it. And by the time they see it in a bid and it doesn't align to the specification, even though it might be better, they can't. I say they can't buy it. Could they buy it, Chris?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one. As you said, Matt, I think for me it's too late. I mean, I have known from a procurement perspective that, you know, when the clarification process starts, where people have actually challenged that approach, you know, and said this isn't reflective and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's enough to push it or change it, I don't know. But yeah, buyers rely on their subject matter experts. Now, if you're in a council, you're relying on the people that are receiving the service. They might not be aware of all these changes or innovation and things like that, or might not be aware of what they really need.
Yep.
So yeah, that education of the market is so important.
I think the biggest issues I've seen with features is often maybe a large company that produces a particular product and they don't have the flexibility to consider adapting their product, or they don't have the ability to adapt that for a bid specification. I say that's often I suppose things where they're manufactured, you have to change a whole factory process to meet the requirements. And I've worked with clients where they've just put in, this is our standard product, and it hasn't actually met the specification. And unsurprisingly, they haven't won.
And I guess that's a difficult conundrum to try and solve, isn't it? Is if your manufacturing plant only manufactures 1, 2, or 3 different bits of kit, it's very difficult to localize then, isn't it? So,
and there is an element of qualification, because in fact they wasted their time doing it. And in one of the cases, it was quite obvious that the commissioner had written a specification for a particular product that somebody else provided. So you've really got to consider that. Yes, you can challenge the process, but I think a really important point there, Matt, is engage pre-bid. If there's a pin, look at it, engage if you can. If there's market testing, engage in that. Don't just dismiss it as, well, you know, you can't win a contract from market testing. If it's for very particular services or products, you need to engage and influence that.
I think the other thing is, if you're on a framework, and you have whatever frequency contract management meetings with likes of CCS or YPO, etc., I would be, as part of the agenda, I would be looking for that added value and what's in development, what are you doing, and you can throw that in at that point, so it helps them consider even 2 years into the contract, because don't forget, they've got to potentially extend. And if there's something market changing coming on, it may be the best thing to do to go back out to market rather than extend because of the developments and bring new supplies in or whatever. So yeah, if you are on frameworks, don't be afraid to influence from within as well.
Yeah. Okay. And at the start of this section, we said this was the simplest thing, but actually, the more and more you talk it through, the more you realise that whilst this is really simple to explain in a bid, this is probably what drives this whole conversation now, and then whether it's relevant. So,
well, I thought that's why you gave it to me, because it was the easiest to explain.
No comment. Right. So, let's move on to advantages. Now, this is where things start to get slightly trickier. And I just mentioned that bit previously where there was a distinction between the customer and the consumer. And when we say consumer, we're talking about end user. So, in this case, it was a patient. It might, if it's, a mobile phone, it's whoever uses that. If it's a car and you're driving as part of the fleet, it's the car. But obviously, someone else is buying that on your behalf. There are all sorts of problems here that are generally always in conflict. So the people that are buying are generally wanting to get the best deal they can. I can't think of too many cases, and again, if people have got examples out there, feel free to share them. But most buyers, and feel free to disagree, Chris, probably want the best value for money product. I wasn't going to say cheapest, but value for money. So, if I've got a company car, I want something that's really comfortable, that's got all the gadgets on and does all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Chris is probably going to buy me a car that's okay, does the job, and I can get by on. And the same with a mobile phone. I might want the latest iPhone or Samsung or whatever it might be, but Chris might be buying me a phone that's 3 generations old because it's the best value. It still does the job. It still makes phone calls and I can text and receive emails. And I think quite often this is where you would need to distinguish between the advantage for the customer and the consumer in very, very clear terms. And if you remember when we started talking about the definitions, so what we said was that an advantage was the problem that's solved. So from Chris's point of view, his problem is that I can't make a phone call, I can't send a text message, I can't send an email on my phone. Chris's solution solves all those problems. My solution is that I want to be able to walk when I get out the car because the seat's nice and comfy and it's got vibrating seats and heated seats and all the other bits and pieces. Chris isn't bothered about that. He just wants a seat in the car. So the two problems are sometimes very different. And quite often you will have a consumer or end user on an evaluation panel, depending on what the product or service is, who will give a view and or score some questions. So it is important to be clear on what the advantages are for customer and consumer.
And there's just a quick point on that, Matt. I don't think one of the things we started doing probably quite a while ago now is when we comes into benefits a bit more, but often in every single question, we make sure there's at least 1 or 2 lines that focus on the end user, even if they're not the buyer.
Which is very often the case in public services. I think there's very little, maybe there's some social care examples. There's a few healthcare examples where an end user can buy directly their own service. Might be interesting, Chris, if you have a think. This is a bit of a last minute question for you, but are there any other examples where you can think of people that are able to directly buy individual products or services? I'll leave you to think about that while I get on to the next point. So I was thinking like in sort of health and social care where they've got their own budget that they can spend on carers and various other bits and pieces. If there's an example, I'll leave you to scratch your head there whilst I get the rest of it. There might not be. So as Rob said in the previous slide, linking back to pre-bid work and specification is really important in this. A lot of the bids that we review for people, we'll look at it and think, and this is post-submission most of the time, we can see why you didn't win because it wasn't aligned to what the customer or consumer wanted, and you were so far off the spec it was sometimes unbelievable. But the pre-bid work and the market education piece is really important because what you're trying to understand here is the problem that you are solving, and that's where the features link to the advantage. And as we said before, there's no point having a feature that doesn't solve a problem. And the problem might be very, very simple. So we don't need like a very complex problem. It might be that it needs to switch on or whatever, the simple term is. So the next point is, does the advantage rely on the product service being users directed? Now, this was a really interesting discussion we had because I'm sure like a lot of people who are listening today, when I get something out of a box, the instructions go in the bin. And I just assume that I am intelligent enough to be able to work it. And Rob's shaking his head because there's so many times when I have to say to him, Rob, how do I do this? Because I've been the instructions. And this is a really important thing. So you might be writing in your bid, this is the problem we're going to solve for you and all this great stuff. You haven't incorporated the possibility that someone's going to use it inappropriately. And when we say inappropriately, just through ignorance or they don't have enough time or whatever it might be, but you've got to factor in the ability of people to break your process and instructions.
I think healthcare is a really good example here, isn't it? For example, let's imagine a weight management service, which will provide all sorts of self-directed help, even a 12-week course or whatever it is. It's all irrelevant if the person reads it, ignores it, and eats exactly what they want. So, although in theory your program might have fantastic advantages, there's probably an element to that particular example where, well, if it's not compelling enough for people to want to read it or understand it, it doesn't actually have any advantage.
Absolutely. The next part of this is your advantage greater than your competitors? And this is a really good one in terms of why would they award the contract to you question, is where you sit. And quite often, particularly with public sector bids, the specification doesn't allow too much variation. So it might be that a lot of products and services are very, very similar. You might have 80% of similarity with all of your competitors, and there might be a little bit that's different. And is that difference a greater problem solving advantage than who you're bidding against? Now that's obviously you've got to look at that in conjunction with price. But this is a really interesting thing to unpack at your end, is pick your top 3 competitors and do this piece of work around what problems do we solve against what problems they solved, and are we better? And if we are better, how much better? Then we've got, at what point does your advantage become too expensive? And that comes back to the value for money thing. So, I used to do a lot of driving, and I want a seat that is very comfortable because I'm in the car for 4 hours one way, 4 hours the next. It's 8 hours a day. I've had cars where I literally can't walk when I get out at the other end and have to sort of act like an old man and do loads of stretching and hobble around a bit. Whereas if I've got a really nice seat to sit in, that problem isn't there. But obviously that comes at an expense. And how much is that valued by the buyer against the consumer? That again would be a really interesting finance exercise to do, is where you sit in terms of value for money. And you can get data on spend for different contracts. So the freedom of information is the obvious one. There's all sorts of other angles that we can do, and Chris can probably advise on that after the webinar. Now, the example we get...
I was just going to say one other quick point on the whole price element is around being flexible as well. So your advantage might be the best thing out there, but does that put you at the top of the financial envelope? Well, if you went down a slight peg with the phone camera, which we'll get onto in a minute, and you knock 20% off your price, does that still solve enough of the problem for the commissioner, whilst giving them a much better value for money option?
And the reverse of that, actually, there's an example that's just come back to me from 7 or 8 years ago now, where I was talking to someone who'd put a bid in. Again, it was a new piece of technology that meant they could do this at half the price. So they put the bid in, they put the financials in. The buyer came back and said, your price looks artificially low. Please explain. Da, 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 da. They explained it all, said, come and visit the factory. We can walk you around it. They still didn't believe them and didn't award the bid, even though it was by far and away the best value bid, because they hadn't done the market education piece. And that, for me, I mean, that's a very rare example, but it's just worth thinking about that as well, particularly if you've got new technology in a product or service. So to try and put that into a little bit of context, I think we've probably done that, but the example that we used and we're talking through when we prepped was the camera. So the problem it's going to solve is that it allows you to capture images far more clearly. We started off by talking about far away, and then I had to chime in, being old, that I need reading glasses, and say sometimes if I go out to a restaurant, I know you can laugh all you want, but it's coming to you as well. I'll be there with the menu at arm's length, and then I can't see, and then I have to get my phone out and I have to zoom in on the menu. And actually, the clarity of image there is really important, as it is if you're trying to take a photo far away. And the younger people were talking about going to concerts and all that sort of stuff that I don't do anymore, and being able to see what's going on the stage. And it might be you're at a sporting event and that sort of thing. So actually, the problem is that you couldn't see properly before. This now solves the problem. That's a very simple example of that. Is there any other jibes that you would like to make about my eyesight before we move on?
I'm the one wearing glasses.
Right. In that case, we will move on. Again, for those people that are watching and listening in, feel free to throw some things in the comments and we'll deal with those. So on to benefits. And Rob, I think you were going to take the lead on this.
Can you just start it a second and I will be there in a second?
Yeah. So if we go back to those definitions that we put up at the start, so the benefit is how your life or experience is improved. And that's a really key thing in this. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for. And Chris, feel free to disagree with this, but as a buyer, that's probably your end point. Is that where you start? So when you're putting procurement together, are you looking at the problem it solves, or how life or experience is improved, or both?
I think it's sort of, if it's an existing contract, I'm trying to understand what's working well and what's not working well, and then out of that potentially will form some of those points. That would be typically where I would go. I'll be asking the stakeholder what's working well, what else do you want to see, and then similar to what we're talking around, the bid strategy and understanding that the win themes and stuff. It's like, what are you wanting to achieve from this? What you had a blank piece of paper, what does good look like, and then trying to bring it out through that.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So essentially, in very simple terms, you are trying to solve someone's problem because you've understood what works well, so that problem's solved. You want to keep that. The stuff that doesn't work well is clearly a problem, and you're trying to solve that problem. So from a procurement angle, the focus is probably on the advantage, so the problem that's trying to be solved. But ultimately, the benefit is mostly going to the consumer in terms of experience or life. It may well be a financial thing. The benefit is that the organisation doesn't spend as much money. But ultimately, it may well be that it's the consumer that benefits.
I think it would depend on the service, wouldn't it? I think there'd be a lot of variation on that, particularly in healthcare, although that often comes down to finance in the end, where you're often talking about whole systems costs. But we do have the example on here about public good.
Yeah. And again, this is well, actually, I won't steal your thunder, Rob. I'll let you carry on.
I'll probably just go around in circles for about 5 minutes. But public good is a really important one. I mean, the mission of the NHS, the Department of Education, etc., a big element of their mission statements, culture, is to improve the public good. So, if your product or service can contribute to that, I would say that's a benefit, potentially, at least. But as we discussed the other day, are these valued in the same way by everyone? No. In some cases, the commissioner just wants to save a load of money, if we're being really cynical, and the public good is no good. So I think there's a very important element to this, is go back to understanding who your customer is. What are their priorities? The pre-bid engagement, the market engagement, reading the procurement documents properly, doing your background research on the commissioner as well. If you're bidding to Birmingham City Council, don't forget they went bankrupt. Okay, so probably quite important to them that actually it's quite cheap, regardless of what the evaluation criteria says. It's got to be affordable, or there has to be decent savings at somewhere in there. I often look at social value. That's another element that's not always properly described in the procurement docs. Look at what their social value priorities are. Give a clear benefit to that. And it doesn't just have to be in the social value question. That can be in other elements of it, that you might be improving their environmental, their carbon emissions as a whole, their indirect carbon emissions. Chris, feel free to correct me if I'm saying things wrong there. But the benefits can be, I hate the word multifaceted, but I'm going to say it. They can be multifaceted, and they will depend on every single different situation, commissioner and bid. You really need to understand what you're selling with your words. I think that made some kind of sense, didn't it?
Yep. Okay. Just before we finish off on this one, and you're going to laugh at me now, because this was a Radio 4 program and this, radio, which actually had Mickey Flanagan on, the comedian, and there's a really interesting series they did around social mobility, and part of that was on education and how little it was valued when he was a child and grew up, and if you were seen to be too clever, you were kind of picked on at school, and it was just about, school had no real value. It was about getting out, getting a job, and being a bit of a lad. and I guess that's, well, I don't guess, I know for a fact that in certain parts of the country, certain demographics don't value education, and it's the same with healthcare. You were talking about the weight management thing, Rob. Same with smoking, same with drinking, all those things that we know are bad for you, or at least increase the risk of things happening that you wouldn't want. People still do. How many times have we talked about, we've been out the weekend and we've done, big pub crawl. We know that's not good for us, but we still do it. And that's part of this, is when we're talking about how to improve life and experience, understanding that sometimes people don't want to do that, and then it's very complex in trying to explain how you would encourage people to do that. And that's often the point, isn't it, to public good, is that you are trying to facilitate change. So part of your solution might be, this is how we would affect change, encourage people to do things. So it's a very difficult and complex part of this, is trying to get to the benefit, because not everybody wants the benefit.
That's to say you've got to understand your customer, the evaluation methodology, the specification. Don't assume the benefit you want to provide is what the customer wants.
Yeah.
Just before we move on, because it's a very important point, if you do not evidence your benefit, it's almost worthless.
Yeah.
You know, because otherwise, all you're giving is opinion. The benefit of what we're doing is that people will live longer. Okay, well, anyone could say that. What does that mean? Does that come from research? Do you have evidence of previous service delivery? Testimonial might not be quite as relevant in this situation, but that can work for other things. You have to back it up with some form of either backwards facing proof or research, or a very firm commitment that you will be able to do it going forward.
Right. Well, that complex set of thinking leads us on to what hopefully is a far simpler methodology. And the reason that I haven't actually described what the WHWW was because I wanted to save the excitement for now.
That's exciting.
To his credit, this is something that Rob came up with on a bid we were working on a while ago. So much as I would love to steal his thunder, I can't. And Rob's now going to explain how, what, how, why, when links to features, advantage, benefits, and might be a simpler way to explain things in a bid.
Yeah. So I'll just give a quick overview of what it is first, just in case people don't know what it is. So what, how, why, when. So what is, this is what we're going to do. In the context of fab, that's often features. It's a simple statement that's usually saying, well, we'll meet whatever you've asked for in the specification. And, you know, this is what the feature does. The how element is going into detail about what, I suppose, the specific elements of those features can do. That's usually something that only you can come up with based on what your feature does. It couldn't be made up, whereas the what anyone could say. The how should be the main part of the answer, describing exactly how you will meet the problem, specification, whatever it is for the commissioner. You then get to why, which is looking at the advantage and the benefits. Although this won't take up as much room as how, usually, this has got to be done right. This is backing up your points. We are solving your problem through our feature. This is the benefit of what it is. Here's some tangible outcomes. Now, why always has to be backed up with when, which is still around benefits, which is the evidence that we were talking about before. Hard numbers, research, testimonials, whatever it is, you've got to prove why what you're offering is solving the problem and or best or better than your competitors, value for money, whatever that is.
I think one of the things there, Rob, that I was just scrolling down was the how. And we've had this conversation with Chris loads of times in the last sort of 6 months, is a lot of scoring systems are quite subjective, and it is provide high confidence that you can deliver X, Y, Z. And the how, I think, is one of the major strands in terms of providing that assurance and confidence. If you say this is what we're going to do as the headline, and then can talk through or provide a process diagram or whatever it might be that Chris can read as a buyer and say, brilliant, I really understand that now. I've got full confidence that they know what they're talking about. There's no holes. I fully understand it. There's no gaps in my head. I'm wondering how they're going to do this or that or the other. That potentially fits really nicely with that confidence part of an evaluation system. Now, that might not be there in whatever bid you're working on at the moment, but quite often we see that. Chris, is there anything you just want to comment on around that kind of slightly subjective system and the confidence element?
Yeah, I mean, confidence is subjective, as you said there, Matt. So I think working back from that, how do you give people confidence? So evidence is key. So numerical numbers or if you can get a testimonial that's lying to you 2 or 3, kind of sentences, particularly if word count's an issue, but that provides that kind of certainty and that confidence would be where I would probably look for it as an evaluator.
I think just going back to how, which, as Matt said, is the trickiest element of it. I think it might be useful to give some examples of what how means. That, for example, it could be that Steve will be delivering this and he will be doing these tasks in as much detail as is required for the question. It's literally talking through how each element will be done, which I think sometimes people often get mixed up with what. It's a very tricky one. Often you could think about process diagrams is another way of looking at it. A process diagram clearly shows how something's going to happen. And it may not be that you can put the process diagram in the bid, but you could always use it as a base to start writing from, or at least thinking in that way.
And I think that's probably one of the things to think about, even if, and I was going to say, let's talk about how we plan, because I think this is really important for all of this, but particularly the how, is before we actually write any content, we generally sit down and plan out how the bid's going to be structured, or the question's response is going to be structured, and then what content we want to put in there. And having a process diagram to be able to talk through and discuss and say, right, well, we can see how it works, because that's what a process diagram's there to do, is for you to look at and understand the process. So that is probably one of the best things to start with, of, right, how do we explain this in words now? And there may well be that, the process diagram's got 147 different things on it, and you need to distill that into 5 and pull out a couple of specific points. So, and this is, obviously part of the art of bid writing, is how you take massive amounts of information and put them onto a page with a limited word count and formatting. And that will come over time, but that comes back to the planning of what is it we really want to tell the reader? How do we make it easy for them to award marks? And that, as we've said in all of our other webinars around bid writing and planning, is probably one of the best uses that you can have of your time when writing a bid, is keep asking yourselves that question in planning. What are we really trying to tell them by saying this? So, with the camera example, you'll be able to see better. What are we really trying to tell them? If we're saying
it's a hard mindset to get into, though, isn't it? Because often, especially as a bid writer, and I hasten to say this isn't me these days, is what do I need to answer the question? That's not actually the mindset. It's not what do I need to answer the question, is what should I be telling them?
Yeah. And then that will inform the how. So if the message is, I don't know, what the real key thing we want to tell them is that we can fit within their budget and they're going to get 2 of 4 outcomes that they've specified. That is our endpoint. So that's the message we want to portray. Then how do we link that back to the how? And tying those 2 bits together are really, really important. The other thing, Rob, I think it's just important to make a distinction between is the when. So when we're talking about benefits and the evidence and all the other bits and pieces, that in my head is where you've done it before and also when you're going to do it in the contract. And I think that's a really important thing to be able to do, because quite often we'll write stuff or we see stuff that says we'll do this at some point over the contract, or we don't put a time on it. And actually, in terms of that confidence thing again, it's really important that if you can say in the first 3 months this will happen, and in year 2 this will happen, in terms of future looking stuff. In terms of the previous or prior experience, in 2021 we had a 30% increase in customer satisfaction or health outcomes or whatever it might be, but make sure that you split out the when into previous experience and what you will do for this customer specifically.
I think put yourself in the commissioner's shoes on that forward-facing element. If you can read as a commissioner that, right, this is going to be in place in June 2024, and they've done it before in that time scale, I mean, that's going to give you confidence, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I know something, I've worked on quite a few bids where people are bidding on contracts that are 5-10 year contracts, and they've got no idea how they're going to deliver some of this stuff. Well, they know how they're going to do it, but they don't know at what point they're going to do it. And so sometimes you have to be a little bit creative, because people are scared, and rightly so in some cases, that if you write something in the bid that you have then held to it. And most buyers and commissioners, I think, would be fairly sensible if there are reasons for not delivering in year 7, because it was 7 years previous, you were working on a whole bunch of assumptions, the world's changed, it might not be possible. So you need to balance that off between being worried that this is going to be something that you've definitely got to deliver, against having a sensible conversation with your customer. And that comes down to relationship. So and I know Chris has talked about this a lot previously around framework managers, contract managers, having a good relationship with them, making sure you understand them. Most people I've worked with on the other side of the table have been very sensible, in terms of this stuff has happened. This is where we were today instead of yesterday. Can we push a timescale? 9 times out of 10, it's always been a sensible conversation with a good outcome. So you need to balance that risk of someone who isn't of that mindset and will hold you to it. Is there anything else on this before we just move on to
do a whole webinar on this? So.
Well, we have done one, I think, haven't we?
Well, not on what, how, why, when in particular. Carry on.
Okay, brilliant. So just to summarize today, we are pretty much at time. Very quickly, every feature needs an ultimate benefit, and that's hopefully what you've got from this conversation. It's not always going to be obvious, and this needs time put into it. So you might look at the feature and think, well, remember, the benefit is that change in life or experience for somebody. So what is the ultimate benefit? And you will probably have to map that through, write it down, talk it through. Somebody that I worked with a few years ago, we used to have all sorts of quite vigorous discussions around different things, and it always led to getting to the point at the end. But sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days to get there. Every advantage needs to solve a problem. And this is what we were talking about previously of, I'm going to solve this problem for you that you don't have. Well, that's, yeah. And I bet you've seen a few bids like that, Chris, over your years, thinking, I didn't realize that was a problem for me. But again, a really key thing. And I think of all this stuff, these are probably the 3 points just to take away from today. And I say 3, there's 5 on the slide, but the top 3. Every benefit needs evidence to support your claim. Otherwise, it is simply your opinion of your product or service, which clearly is going to be biased. So try and turn opinion into fact through evidence. The last 2 points, this is where it gets back to that, why would they award you the contract? So when we're talking about win things, we're probably talking about 2 to 4 things that really separate you from your competition and link you to your customer or consumer. And the value proposition is essentially the summary of that. So why would they award you the contract in 1 or 2 sentences? This is a really interesting one of whether you simply say we're going to use features, advantage, benefits, or we're going to use what, how, why, when, or combine them. Now, I don't think we've got a firm view on that. We're still working through this. We still use both methodologies, but I think when we combine both of them, generally we're scoring 5 out of 5 answers, if the word count allows. And that's always the tricky thing with all this.
If the word count allows, and if the client can articulate the feature, advantage, benefit, it's much harder to do the feature, advantage, benefit than the what, how, why, when.
Yes.
And not every client is able to go through that journey on feature, advantage, benefit with every single element of it.
Yep. And I think, there's bidders that we work with, Rob, who at the start of the bid don't know what the delivery model is. They don't know what the workforce model is. And that has to be done in the bid period, which is challenging, but not impossible. And it focuses everyone's minds because, with a lot of people we work with, people have got day jobs, bidding isn't necessarily their core function. So it does focus the mind, and quite often at the end of it, what they're left with is a really good write-up of what they do and the benefits of it. So even though the bid might not win, they've got a better understanding of what their business is doing for their customers and consumers. Chris, is there anything you'd just like to finish with on that?
I think you summarised it. Maybe subconsciously you're picking up all the points that I usually try and impart on you both. Obviously, we kind of strategize and plan this out for today. So all the key points are there really. And just make sure the key point I would say to take away is tailor it to what the commissioner or buyer's asking for in that scoring criteria, because it can change from bid to bid.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we're pretty much bang on time, which is a miracle for us. So well done for keeping us on track. I was keeping everyone on track. Well done for not talking too much, you two. Thank you very much for that. I hope everyone who's joined us, that's been useful. As we said at the start, we will pick somebody probably on Monday now for the offer of the 1 hour bids writing training. You can use that for what we've just talked about today, or for anything else you want to relating to bid writing. If you do need us, the slides will go out as well afterwards, or they'll certainly be on the website, at the BidVantage website and the LinkedIn page. If you need us in the meantime, please feel free to give Chris or I a ring or an email, and we will happily have a chat with you about any bid related problems you've got, or if you just want to chat about bidding in general. If you're local, I'm sure I'll be happy to go and have a cup of coffee, and if not, we'll do it virtually. So have a great weekend, everyone. Hope that's been useful, and we will catch up with you on next month's webinar.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.